Where did your interest in vampires and sort of the supernatural begin? And also, what's your favourite novel in the genre?
Mhm. Read a lot of paranormal when I was younger, a lot of paranormal young adult books, and a lot of them just ended up being vampire books. And at the time, and still, I guess, I found vampires to be very sexy. So there was something appealing about that because they're always, really good looking and really rich and practically invulnerable. And so that sounds appealing on some levels. I think my favorite vampire series would have to be Christopher Pike's The Last Vampire, and it has a female protagonist, and she's very human in a lot of ways, like my vampires are.
Yeah, because that's interesting. Because one thing I wanted to ask you is obviously Lily's a strong female protagonist as well, and I wondered how important you think it is for your work to contain these strong female characters, and also whether you think there's kind of a lack of them in modern fiction as well.
I think it's really important for my work to contain strong female characters, and they don't have to be strong always in the traditional sense. I think it's good too to have weakness and
Mm,
vulnerability, and you can actually prove your strength by being vulnerable,
yeah.
which is one of the main themes, actually, I think, of this series. But in general, do I think there's I don't think that there's a dearth necessarily of strong female characters, but I do think that we still have a lot of the traditional ideas about what it means to be woman and man, masculine and feminine, especially in heterosexual literature. And one of the things, for example, is that in a lot of romance, women's sexuality is passive, meaning the woman kind of is overwhelmed by the man's sexual energy and kind of goes along for the ride, but doesn't have a whole lot of her own agency.
Yeah.
And that's something that I'd like to challenge. And I tried to do that a little bit with Lily, but it's something that I continue to work on in my future work.
Yeah, I mean that will make sense, and I think it's not even necessarily in sort of sexual terms, but quite often you'll find a female character in a book will just be because there needed to be someone for the male protagonist to bounce off, I suppose, and no pun intended, really. and yeah, I mean, I think it is important myself to get more of kind of a well-rounded character, as you said, to show weakness as well as strength, but not to just have one characteristic defining the whole character.
Yeah, well, and I think too, I mean, you raise a good point, and I think it depends too greatly on what genre you're
Yeah,
looking at and whether it's a man or a woman writing it.
yeah, that makes sense. And actually, so because one of the things as well with having, I suppose, these well-rounded characters is you've actually mentioned on your Facebook page how sometimes main characters just do what they want when you start to write. And I wondered how often do your characters take on a life of their own, and whether you can give us an example of a time when that happened.
hmm Yeah, when I started writing book two, I had an idea that Jimmy Derrick from book one was still alive, and he was going to be the antagonist in book two. And I was having such a hard time writing him in and figuring out when does he show up, and then realizing, well, I mean, he's a new vampire too, so he's kind of in the same boat as Lily. So does it really make sense that he would be capable
Mm.
of doing all these things? And it sounds kind of weird, but actually, what I ended up doing is asking him, like,
Yeah, yeah.
had a conversation with myself, but he had his own voice, and he told me he was dead, and that really screwed up my plans. So, um, yeah, that would be one example of characters kind of doing something different than what I thought was going to happen.
Yeah, and taking you by
I had
surprise.
Yeah, it did take me by surprise, and And even though actually it screwed up my plans in some major ways, it also solved a lot of problems. So, the characters know best in the end. But it is frustrating when you get to a certain point in your process and you put all this time and energy into outlining and planning it out, and then the characters have some different ideas about how it should go.
Yeah,
Do you find that in yours too?
Yeah, occasionally. Yeah, it's a bit odd when you feel as though you're being dictated rather than dictating, I suppose. But so
Yeah.
a couple more things I wanted to know about actually. I know you actually sometimes review books on your own site as well, and it's something that interests me. Do you think that being a writer actually gives your book reviews more credibility? Do you think critics need to sort of dabble in what they're critiquing?
Oh, that's a really good question. I guess I hadn't really thought about it that way.
Mm.
I think that what gives me confidence as a book reviewer is my training in English literature.
Yeah.
And when I was studying English lit, I wasn't writing fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess no, I don't think that you have to be a writer in order to know what you're talking about and write reviews. But I do think that being a writer makes me a more compassionate reviewer.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that. Yeah, I suppose in many ways, then it's actually you need to be a reader to be a reviewer or a critic more than anything.
Yeah, I agree with that. Because, I mean, part of it, and it depends on what angle you want to do, but for me, it's about context. It's about knowing what this particular book is doing in the context of our culture, but also within the context of other books in its genre.
Yeah. So one thing as well I was wondering about is obviously you're kind of challenging the norms around women's sexuality, and I wondered how do you think they should be changed? What's the end goal for you, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I mentioned previously was the passive sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that, and it's not just women's sexuality, it's men's sexuality too that I want to challenge, because I consider myself to be a contemporary feminist, which means equality for all and not just women. So if you read romance, I don't know, is that something that you read very much?
It's not something I go out and buy, but I occasionally get sort of sent some stuff. So
in traditional romance, whether it's paranormal or historical or contemporary, the guys are all like broad-shouldered and chiseled and have strong jawlines and cut abs, and the women there's starting to be a slightly wider range of quote unquote acceptable sexy body types for women, probably because women are the ones normally writing romance. And so you have an entire sort of niche devoted to BBW, big beautiful women, and women who aren't fit and thin but are curvy and more the Marilyn Monroe or Mae West type. Yeah. And the one I'm working on right now actually has that kind of heroine in it. But what I wanted to do for the guy is not have him fit that body type. Yeah. And he's got a little bit of extra padding around the middle.
Bit of a beer belly.
I don't know, how many guys do you know run around with six packs?
I know I don't. So. Well, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. It's interesting actually because we spoke to for our last interview we spoke to a guy called Marias Gabriel, and he's writing sort of historical thrillers at the moment, but he made a living for about 20 odd years writing for Mills and Boon, and he had to write under a female pseudonym because basically the readers didn't want to read a romance book written by a man. So it's quite interesting that you say it, a lot of the readers and the writers are women.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I actually just ran across on Twitter a male romance writer. I haven't had a chance to check out his work yet, but because he's a man, I'm like instantly more interested. Yeah. Because I don't know that I've read a lot of romance written by men.
Yeah, it's kind of a point of difference, isn't it, I suppose? So I've got a few more questions because we're not running out of time, but we've sort of got about another 5 minutes or so. And one thing I wondered, what do you think kind of the youngest age is your work is suitable for? Whether it's sort of 18 plus or whether it's kind of sort of for teenagers as they find themselves? What would you say?
It's definitely 18 plus, because in our culture, it's acceptable to, and by our culture, I'm referring to US, but I think probably in the UK too, there are some ideas about things that children should and should not be exposed to,
Yeah.
and explicit sex would be one of them. Which is interesting because I got into romance novels when I was 9 or 10, and found my grandma's stash of Harlequins, and I don't feel traumatized as a result. But that's the culture.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so you're in the middle of a blog tour at the moment as well. And actually, by the time this comes out, it'll be near the end. But I just wondered if you could tell us sort of what that involved, how successful it's been so far, any thoughts you've had on it so far.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the third company that I've toured with.
Yeah.
And I'm really pleased. I'm with Fire and Ice Book Tours, which is run by Shelley Ice, and I'm really pleased with the service. This one is a month long, which is the longest that I've ever done. And it also, as a result, is the most expensive. But so far, I haven't had a single missed stop, and the prompts for the guest posts have been interesting. And every week, even though, I mean, one of the things about the tours is you don't want just the same excerpt and book info up on every single blog, because that's boring. I mean, there's no reason for people to follow it, really, if that's all it is, I think. So each week there's a good mix of things, and I'm really excited about this interview because I don't know anybody else that has done an audio interview before. So I was really excited when you offered this to me. So thanks, Dane.
Oh, that's no problem. No, we like doing that because it makes it a bit different, and you can kind of have a conversation as well. So I think it helps to get more in depth, I suppose. It's actually one of the problems with written interviews is that people will answer a question and you want to know more, but obviously you've already sent the questions over, so you can't ask follow-ups.
Yeah.
So
I do like conversational style.
Yeah, definitely. I think it works really well. So a couple more questions to end on. One thing we ask everybody is, what was the last book you read and what did you think of it?
Well, I'm really glad that I just read a good book last night because I wouldn't want to tell you otherwise. I've been reading a lot of free romance lately, just to see what it's like. And the last book I read, I finished a book called At Any Price. It's a contemporary romance, and I actually can't remember who wrote it right now. That's really bad, but I can look it up and send it to you. It's a contemporary romance and it's new adult. So it's a 22-year-old woman who's she's a gaming geek.
Okay.
And so that right away caught my attention because that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's not very traditional, is it? So, but it does sound interesting. That's actually caught my attention as well.
Yeah. And I mean, it definitely has some very conventional elements to it. The hero, her love interest is tall, dark, and handsome with chiseled abs and has boatloads of money. But in other ways too, because she's such an, quote unquote, unlikely heroine, it was really interesting to me. And the author, I thought, did a really good job on the sexual tension, which is always something I'm trying to learn how to do better. And there's an interesting morality question, because the premise of the book is that there's this 22-year-old woman who's decided to sell her virginity in order to pay her mom's medical bills.
That is interesting.
And so there's this moral question of basically prostitution, which is not how she sees it in the beginning. She actually sees it as a feminist statement. So that, because I'm a self-proclaimed feminist, that was really interesting to me.
Yeah, cool. And so just one last question to end on. What's up next for you? Can you tell us a bit about what you've got planned in terms of your writing, and also after the book tour's finished?
Yeah. Well, right now I'm working on a contemporary romance called At First Blush, and I expect to be done with it this year. I keep I keep not being done with it when I think I'm going to be, but I think it'll be better for it in the end. And then I have a historical pirate romance that takes place in the Caribbean that I'm working on also. Yeah, and then I have all of these short story erotica ideas. But At First Blush is about a romance novelist who writes under pseudonym, and she's a high school English teacher by day, and she's on tour with her book and runs into an old flame. And the book that she's touring with was written about her romance with this man, so it puts her in an interesting position when they go out for dinner.